A dungeon is a room or cell in which prisoners are held, especially underground. Dungeons are generally associated with medieval castles, though their association with torture probably belongs more to the Renaissance period. An oubliette, a bottle dungeon, is a form of dungeon which is accessible only from a hatch in a high ceiling. Etymology: the word dungeon comes from French donjon, which means keep, the main tower of a castle. The first recorded instance of the word in English was near the beginning of the 14th century, when it held the same meaning as donjon. The proper original meaning of keep is still in use for academics, although in popular culture it has been largely misused and come to mean a cell or oubliette, though it is uncertain. Both dungeon and donjon are thought to derive from the Middle Latin word dominio, meaning lord or master. In French, the term donjon still refers to a keep, and the English term dungeon refers mostly to oubliette in French. Donjon is therefore a false friend to dungeon. An oubliette was a form of prison cell which was accessible only from a hatch in a high ceiling. The word comes from the same root as the French oubliette, to forget, as it was used for those prisoners the captors wished to forget. The use of donjons evolved over time, sometimes to include prison cells, which could explain why the meaning of dungeon in English evolved over time from being a prison within the tallest, most secure tower of the castle into meaning a cell, and by extension, in popular use, an oubliette or even a torture chamber. The earliest use of oubliette in French dates back to 1374, but its earliest adoption in English is Walter Scott's Ivanhoe in 1819. The place was utterly dark, the oubliette, as I suppose, of their accursed convent. History: few Norman keeps in English castles originally contained prisons, though they were more common in Scotland. Imprisonment was not a usual punishment in the Middle Ages, so most prisoners were awaiting trial, sentence, or a political solution. Noble prisoners were not generally held in dungeons, but lived in some comfort in castle apartments. The Tower of London is famous for housing political prisoners, and Pontefract Castle at various times held Thomas of Lancaster, Richard II, Earl Rivers, Scrope, Archbishop of York, James I of Scotland, and Charles, Duke of Orleans. Purpose-built prison chambers in castles became more common after the 12th century, when they were built into gatehouses and mural towers. Some castles had larger provision for prisoners, such as the prison tower at Carnarvon Castle. Features: although many real dungeons are simply a single plain room with a heavy door with access only from a hatchway, a trapdoor in the floor of the room above. The use of dungeons for torture, along with their association to common human fears of being trapped underground, have made dungeons a powerful metaphor in a variety of contexts. Dungeons, in the plural, have come to be associated with underground complexes of cells and torture chambers. As a result, the number of true dungeons in castles is often exaggerated to interest tourists. Many chambers described as dungeons or oubliettes were in fact storerooms, water cisterns, or even latrines. An example of what might be popularly termed an oubliette is the particularly claustrophobic cell in the dungeon of Warwick Castle's Caesar's Tower, in central England. The access hatch consists of an iron grille. Even turning around would be nearly impossible in this tiny chamber. A bottle dungeon is sometimes simply another term for an oubliette. It has a narrow entrance at the top, and sometimes the room below is even so narrow that it is impossible to lie down, but in other designs the actual cell is larger. The identification of dungeons and rooms used to hold prisoners is not always a straightforward task. Alnwick Castle and Cockermouth Castle, both near England's border with Scotland, had chambers in the gatehouses which have often been interpreted as oubliettes. However, this has been challenged. These underground rooms were built without latrines, and since the gatehouses at An and Cockermouth provided accommodation, it is unlikely that the rooms would have been used to hold prisoners. An alternative explanation was proposed, suggesting that these were strong rooms where valuables were stored.